Good afternoon and most welcome to Heidegger 970. We have now left the tropics and we have gone to a very nice loft, 6 stories high above Gothenburg, and it's a very nice place to be. I feel spacious. I was thinking of mentioning something very interesting from Susie Froebel's fantastic book Fractal Time, and this is a subject that is rather hard to understand. It has to do with time limits and horizons for our different senses. It's something called simultaneity, and there is a gap, a span. Within that span, we will perceive things to be simultaneous. So, when it comes to the audio, it's 6 milliseconds. When it comes to tactile, it's 10 milliseconds. When it comes to visual, it's up to 20 to 30 milliseconds. So the difference is quite extraordinary. It is actually 5 times as long with the visual as audio. What does that mean? It means that if we see a passing truck and it gives noise, and the span for some noise, maybe there's a clonk coming from the engine or something, and we see something, if the thing seen is within the span of 20 to 30 seconds, it will be simultaneous with other things that happens in the same time span. We can't tell the difference. We can't tell which one is first. It will be absolutely spontaneous, simultaneous. But when it comes to the audio, it's a bare 6 milliseconds. Music would not be possible if that time span was any longer than that. The whole music and our language is based on that simultaneity time span. We need to discern down to 6 milliseconds, whereas the visual takes into account the distance. That means that we can perceive things that are 100 meters away as simultaneous. It does take some time for the light to come to us. That makes for a greater span of simultaneity, whereas sound is more distinct, more precise. These different things, in this example is visual, tactile and audio, they nest each other. So it means that they are codependent. We need them all. They are all fractal. In a way, they are all same, but they are also very different. And this difference is hearing, seeing, being tactile. We need all 3 of them. Actually, we need all 6 of them, the 6 senses. They all have different time span, and the time spans are very important to discern differences. This is often called the perceptual simultaneity window. And so to speak, we could say, and this is a term to be careful on, the first time I read it, I took it very literal. It is literal from a scientific way, but for us as perceivers, here we have a difference. From the endogenous perspective, they are simultaneous. From an exogenous, possible Laplacian demon, it would be positively to say that a flash from a flashing thing, like a camera or something, when it makes its sound, it's going to be completely simultaneous. And that also goes for Blixt. What on earth is that? Is that the flash? It's a flash, yeah. If the flash is closer than 500 meters, the sound and the lightning will come simultaneous. But if the distance is larger, the sound will come afterwards. And it's then being out of reach for simultaneity. This is how it's built up. And there is a good reason there being variation in time. We use time to understand space. Earlier I mentioned that from Lakoff Johnson and also from E. McGilchrist, who explained that we use space to understand time. But there is also the opposite going on. We use time to understand space. When I'm standing here in this little room, even if I shut my eyes, I can, from the echo of my own voice, understand the size of the room. I know it's a small room. My voice doesn't sound at all like it did in the other room next doors. And actually, we also know that there's furniture in this room. Otherwise, my echo would be very different. We are constantly aware of this. One thing that happened recently was the development of electric cars. Nobody, I didn't, had any idea that we are constantly listening to motor sounds. I was so surprised the first time I crossed the road and all of a sudden a car sort of comes into existence. And I was wondering, how is that possible? How come I didn't see it? And then I realized I hadn't been looking in that direction. And I haven't been doing that for a good reason. I could not hear anything. It was an electric car. They are now developing a sound for electric cars because they had a lot of accidents already. We are not aware that we make space from time. We are constantly listening to sounds around us, but we're also listening to the sounds that we emit from my movement. If I walk here in this room, I can also hear on my own footstep that I am in a rather crowded room. It's hearable, and we know that we perceive that, but we're not constantly aware of it, but we still use it. This is something that the development psychologist H.H. Clarke developed into something that is called complexity theory. And it shows that we are constantly using our different senses in a nested-in way. So in a way, they cannot be discerned. They help each other and they go into each other. And thereby they are actually making their differences even more clear. By sameness, we can have difference. Clarke noticed that a child had continuous acquisitions of rules of application. This rather cumbersome word is that they learn by listening, by seeing, by touching, also language. And they learn what he called rules. This is something that Susie Froebel called lods, but they are equal to rules. And the developing child can come into situations where there is no lot present for that particular child. He has, so to speak, not learned the rule yet. It says the following in the book: often, however, the child will find himself confronted with a situation he cannot comprehend by means of metaphors already at his disposal. In such cases, he would either not respond or try to use metaphors he is already familiar with. Clark cites an example of a small boy who, when looking at the picture book, was asked, "When did the boy jump the fence?" Pointing to the fence in the picture, he answered, "There." That is, the boy had chosen to apply a spatial metaphor familiar to him, rather than a temporal one that he had not yet mastered. Building on such observation, Clark did later formulate the complexity hypothesis, which is based on the correlation between human levels of perception and the appropriate language levels. It states that the order in which spatial concepts are acquired is imposed by rules of application, which include direction, point of reference, and dimension. If, of two terms, A and B, B requires all the rules of application, A requires plus an additional one, then A is acquired before B. So this is an hypothesis how we learn different words and rules. And these rules are very important. I'm just going to put some coffee. I felt the need for some caffeine here to further my senses. Now we come to an example here. An example is the order in which the prepositions in, into, and out of are acquired. In presupposes a three-dimensional space. Into proposes a three-dimensional space plus a positive direction. We have to go into something. That is to say, in the direction of the stronger perceptual field, and out of presupposes a three-dimensional space, a positive direction, and a negation of this direction. Because it says out of. So we acquired first in, then we acquire into, and finally out of. Since the second and the third preposition each require all the rules of application of the preceding one, plus one in addition. The complexity hypothesis predicts for spatial and temporal terms the following order of acquisition. In antonymous pairs, the positive term will be learned before the negative one. And let me put in a footnote here. This is exactly the thing we discussed 3 lectures ago, when I declare that the opposition between two things, inner and outer, can actually block understanding that lies underneath. In my example, it was mammals and marsupials. Now you can understand already in the spatial manner how a child, when it's developing, acquire everything in a specific order. And the previous understandings are simpler, less complex, less fractal, less prone to give knowledge, and if they get too firmly established, they will also block out knowledge, like in the example of marsupial and mammal. This is very important to remember when I step into the next level here. Antonymous pairs, the positive term will be learned before the negative one. So we don't learn them together. That could be very important to remember, because we think that antonyms exist out there. Even the very word anti used to be opposite of, or on the other side. And he has later developed into a more complex thing, but remembering the level of complexity, and also when you learn it, we start to understand it is not, so to speak, fundamental. It's not before. I would say that Augustinus, he would directly say, oh, the child already knows antonyms from his birth, something like that. Because Aquinas would say, in his worldview, that has to be something of the world. Antonyms for him exist out there only, part of reality. And this is the reason we learn into before out of, because out of has an antonym. At, on, in are acquired before to, onto, and into, because the latter require an additional direction. In doesn't require a direction. We are in the room now. We don't need a direction. It is less complicated, less complex. Out of the room requires three things. A direction out of the room, into the room, which we negate. This is very interesting. This is actually deconstruction. We learn that antonyms do not exist simultaneous. We can use them simultaneous, but their history in learning and also in human development as a species in our civilization, antonyms did not come simultaneous. I really hope Aristotle is not listening to this. He will turn in his grave at least 2,000 rotation per minute. It would be horrible for him to hear this. For him, antonyms had always existed in humanity, and it's impossible for the world not to have antonyms. Very big portion of his philosophy is based on that. And so is Plato, and so is Parmenides, and so is Sophocles, so is Zenon, Xenophanes. And this is one of the reasons I say Susie Frobel is an excellent deconstructor. Yes?
And this confirms also what Heidegger said, we are already in the world.
Yes. You're already in the world. Sometimes we forget that. I think we will always forget that. And what he says is not one absolute remember that. Rather, remember that from a daily basis and you will learn more. Do it katamera, so to speak, every day. You will discover more and more things that got hidden because of this. Location prepositions such as at, on, in are mastered before correlative location preposition such as above. Above takes two things. Above this. Whereas at, on, in doesn't take that. Above, in front of, as the latter require a point of reference in addition. Tall and short will be learned before thick and thin, because the latter requires an additional dimension. Unmarked neutral terms which lack connotation will be acquired before marked neutral terms loaded with usually negative connotation. Positive terms are acquired before their negative opposites, with the positive term determining their dimension. So first we have long, and then to that we add short, and then we get length. every additional rule of application adds another layer. That is to say, another lod. Lod is Susie Frober's word for rule, something that we learn. Rule in this case is something not by authority, it's something we actually need for our daily life. New lods provide a new context by adding, for instance, a direction or a connotation, which makes the term more complex. As this form of complexity retains the earlier acquired simpler terms, we can say that the simpler terms are nested. This is good. Nested. Do you see the nestedness? On, above, we have a nestedness. In this we have on and above. Above have both on and another thing. It has a situation being placed on and a direction, so to speak. It is not under. The reason I chose this paragraph is to, yet from another approach, show how complexities grows and how they do that in an ordered fashion. And that ordered fashion comes from, one could say, from one point of view from space itself, but it also comes from how we interact with the world. The endogenous part. How do we choose to interact with the world? And you can see all of a sudden the word choice is there. We do something. The child did something. It wasn't necessary for the child to learn antonyms. I would say 99% of all children do learn it. But there must be some child who neglected to learn it. That could actually happen. It's enough to remember that to sort of deconstruct antonyms. And they will not disappear as good helping tools. Now they will actually be much more effective. Negation will have its place in the interaction with the world, and there is where they are supposed to be situated. It's not an inflation of these words. It's actually the discovery how incredibly useful they are. Deconstruction once more. Sort of wonder if Derrida even is mentioned in the reference. No, it wasn't. Makes it even more interesting. New lods provide a new context by adding, for instance, a direction or connotation which makes the term more complex. As this form of complexity retains the earlier acquired simpler terms, we can say that the simpler terms are nested in more complex one, a fractal arrangement. So that simpler forms never disappears. It's a sort of a nesting procedure. And this very nesting procedure reminds me a lot of the illustration I made yesterday, but since it was so dark, I will see if I can find it once more. This is also better drawn. Here we can see now, pretension, retention, how there is a nesting of nows. This is what's happening with the preposition. It's also happening with the different nows. You can start to understand pretension, retention is also something that we acquire by time. It takes time, interaction. And once they learn, we can build new lods to make the nesting even more complex. And there is actually no stop to this complexity. Because the bigger now with the big N, it will grow for every nesting that is done. We don't lose out, we keep the original nestings. This is a fractal arrangement explained in a very different way. Against the background of fractal temporal perspective, learning is a result of generating new rules of application in the form of LODs. By contextualizing these LODs with every new experience or recollection, we continue to nest them into a cascade of LODs, which each time leads to further increase in delta T depth. I think you can understand now how this is making for depth. For every nesting procedure, the complexity is the depth. Remember above, because above already takes on in its nesting. This has an effect on our perception of time, so we sort of build time. When we have generated a large number of LODs, we are in a position to arrange events in nesting, i.e. enduring relations, rather than having to successively arrange them, like beads on a string on one LOD. When I say like beads on a string, that is of course linear time. That is also the time the poor child we saw just earlier, the son of the landlord's daughter. So you see, you can have linear time. You can also have, can you raise this a little bit? You can also have a greater complexity. And this could explain why a summer of one's childhood is so incomparably much longer than a summer of one's adulthood. For every complexity level we add, we can shorten by our own will the time felt, and especially in retention when we do another nesting, because we already have so many nestings. The act of recollecting, now we are getting into memory, may be regarded as learning too, as nesting means arranging past events in a new context. So every time we look at a memory, we are creating a new nesting. And our efficiency in doing that nesting to a certain purpose will means that it's more effective. Such nestings by recollection often occurs in clusters when a number of people discuss past events they remember. Examples of typical recollection clusters comprise class reunions, weddings, anniversary, housewarming parties, and family slideshows on Christmas Eve. Think of a class reunion where recollection continue to be nested and rearranged, as all stories are discussed, corrected, and retold by the former classmates. As a result of this continuous increase of simultaneity, delta T depth increases perceptually, and delta T length by contrast contracts steadily. For the former classmates, time flies. For the pitiable accompanying husband and wives, delta T length increases steadily. They can't do the nesting. They are not part of the same past. As they cannot join in the recollecting and have to arrange every more or less insignificant, insightful remark of the former classmates on a constant number of LODs. In other words, they are bored stiff. I had described this familiar phenomenon of subjectively varying perceptions of duration in chapter 2. Now maybe it could be more understandable how we in ordinary speak have these two different conceptions. Subjective time, I went to the class reunion, the wife or the husband would say, and it never stopped. It was going on for eternity. And then you have the actual classmate is going to say, tempus fugit, the time flew. It was incredibly interesting to have all these memories. And a new nesting took place. Both these measures plus the resulting fractal dimension are measures for comparing the temporal complexity of processes. When we use the notion of complexity, we usually have some vague idea of what we mean by it. In everyday language, we may equate complexity with complicatedness. However, it is worth taking a closer look at this concept, since it reveals possibly unreflected assumptions we maintain about absolute and relative order. You see here, order is incredibly important. And it's a little bit our internal timing, our endogenous timing is so important that we will not be able to get into the time we share with others if our internal clock, our internal nesting, it's not fractal towards the outside in enough complex manner. And I also see signs of this. In my own country, Sweden, we used to have a time schedule on trains that were actually quite accurate. The first time I went outside Sweden, it was in the early 80s, and already coming down to Denmark, I noticed there was a time shift. They were not as clocked. The further south I went, the more delays we had, exception being France, where everything was on time. Going down to southern Italy, over to Yugoslavia, it was a constant time delay, always, no exception. And the time delay could be hours. 6-7 hours was not unusual. This is the case in Sweden today. And it's not hard to make the conclusion. This simulacra we are living in now, we're no longer participating in a communal time. We're no longer nesting together with others. And an obvious way of showing that us is how the trains are running today. And that ability diminished by society, because we are all nested together. This is not something we stand outside of. This needs to be explained in a manner that is scientific. We cannot use the idea of representation here because it's void of information. It doesn't inform anything. It has to go down to the deepest level of understanding, which is fractality. In Clarke's hypothesis, the notion of complexity refers both to the degree of difficulty of applying rules as well as the intrinsically complicated structure of those rules themselves. There are at least as many senses of the word complexity as there are human faculties, some relating to the level of internal organization of a structure, others to the difficulty of describing or constructing a structure. Some measures of complexity are, at first sight, defined in their intrinsic organization. Algorithmic complexity in such a case, it uses the length of the most compact description of an object as a measure of complexity. Here I really need a whiteboard, but I'm going to help you as much as I can. If we compare the two strings xxy, 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 and the LQH, SEH, GUB, VAPK, ZY, the first one seems to be less complex because we can formulate a simple generation rule. Simple generation rule means that we can just have a rule that says after 3 x's we have 1 y. And then you can construct the whole algorithm and you can go on forever. Whereas in the second example with LQHIC and so forth, there can't be made a rule. Accordingly, the shortest description is the string itself. It cannot be a LOD or a simplification of it. And this is exactly what happens in a book, for instance. Let's take a book. Once you start reading the book, your complexity level will be the thing that reads off the complexity level of the book. If your algorithm, and this is true, if your algorithm are not complex enough, they cannot read off the deepest complexity of the book. But I can still have a shallow understanding of the book. So take these two course examples, a very shallow take on a book and the deepest possible. You see, according to fractality, there is almost no limit to the depth you can get into a book. Once your own fractality, your own timing, your own understanding of before, after will be more complex, because a book is not only the spatial extension, it's also a sequencing. And that sequencing is as important as the spatial extension. That is one of the reasons the word difference in the neologisms of Derrida takes the form of both differ in time and in space. So you start understanding here there can be so much more out of the book, and your own fractality decides how much you get out of the book. There is no limit to it. Actually, the whole idea that this book has only one reading is in itself something majorly wrong. It's a low level of complexity. It is almost like the polarity between marsupials and mammals. And that understanding will block deeper understanding from the book. Susie Frobel have proved scientifically why deconstruction is important without even knowing about deconstruction, I think. John Casti, another scientist in this area, describes the algorithmic complexity of an object as directly proportional to the length of the shortest possible description of that object. That's a very circumstantial way of saying there is a shorter way of expressing something. And in the first example was after two x's we have one y. In the second example there is no shorter description. A string of letters is random if there is no rule for generating it whose statement is appreciably shorter. That is, requires fewer letters to write down than the string itself. So an object or pattern is random if its shortest possible description is the object itself. Another way of expressing this is to say that something is random if it is incompressible. This idea forms the basis for the theory of algorithmic complexity. Let me give you an example of something that is compressible. I need to reach for my wallet. This is a piece of compressed information. This is a compressing that is rather recent in history. It doesn't have more than 2 or 3 millennia. And this is compressing food, work, and other things. This did not come about easily. It took several hundred years until people started to trust the antecedent of money, which was silver. And then from silver we had coins. Coins is a compressed unit of information. It also takes away some of the information. For the same money I can buy an interesting book, or I can invest in a new thermos that never gets cold or something interesting that Chinese produced. This shows the complexity inherent in this 50 euro
note.
And we have this compression constantly around us. And one could say this is a huge exaggeration, but if we get stuck in some compression or level and we start to approach something, Kalle wants to tell me something complex, that when he went outside he saw this man, and that man had something in his bag, and I just said that just a regular man. What's the complexity? I compress too much. I have an example of that. A friend of mine who's an ornithologist. Yes, I managed to pronounce it. He came back one day after we had a visit in Central America, and he was really upset because he saw some birds at a distance, and he asked some fellow people around him, they were Americans, could you describe that bird for me, because I don't have my glasses with me. And they just said, I don't bother about that, it's just some bird. That's two different levels of compression. And I think my friend didn't really understand that, so he came back and he was absolutely mad. Typically Yankees, I hate those fellows. I think that was unnecessary. We have different levels of compression, and these people didn't cause any harm. But what could cause a harm is you start read something, you approach a subject, and your compression level is stuck somewhere. And then you will not see the possibilities. One example I will take now is coming from MacGyver. Let's see here, let's take a more modern example of the same thing, this one. For me that is electronic money. It is even more a simplification of this one. It took a little bit of getting used for me. But oddly enough, this can also be used to opening doors. If you're locked in somewhere, you can actually press this very hard and you can open the door because you enter into that knob that opens the door inside. Something showed by MacGyver. I would say MacGyver is one of those fellows who is a deconstructionist. He uses things that we have around us to cause explosions, making weapons, finding ways of distilling water so we can drink it and so forth. What he is doing, actually from one viewpoint, is a sort of deconstruction. And those of you who have seen MacGyver, you understand there is no bottom level. There is no absolute understanding. Deconstruct something doesn't really mean to go to the more original meaning. It is to enter another world of complexities. So deconstruction doesn't have that sense of absoluteness. Not going to the atoms of meanings or anything like that, or saying that difference is the essence of everything. Actually, the project is more interesting, it's more intriguing, it's not that boring just to use the whole hand and say difference is the essence. No, it is much more interesting, it's much more revealing, opening up, and it can't actually be sort of captured in one definition. You can't say to people deconstruction is this. In one way we all do it all the time, in another way we could do it more. And we discover constantly new things. It is more about loosening up limitations. And you keep the limitations you had in the beginning. You don't lose anything. It's not like putting your foot down and saying everything should be deconstruction like those crazy people out in Oregon. No, not about that. It's about keeping the old limits while seeing you can open them up, and you can use this. When I use this to open a door, it doesn't mean I'm stuck there. I can never use this to pay my coffee or something like that. It would be nonsense to claim that. But this is actually what Jordan Peterson claims. It says deconstructionists are destroying rationality. And by deconstruct and show you can use this for another purpose, you take away the original purpose, being able to pay your bills with it. This is purely nonsensical. This is not what deconstruction is about. And Jordan Peterson constantly referring to the destroyers of rationality, Derrida and Foucault, is absolutely wrong. And now we can add science to this as well, because not on a single page is she not doing deconstruction. The double negative was intended. It's happening on every page. She doesn't have an idea of what deconstruction is in a Derridian fashion. This comes from mathematics, topology and physics. Still, it's doing the same thing. And we can keep whatever limit we want. Still use this as money, and I can possibly use it for other purposes as well. I don't know which more they are. I can use it to show color, for instance. I want this color on my wall. And I can stretch my hand. I can use it to show size. Look at this cup, it's rather big. I'm glad I'm not drinking coffee from this cup. It would be too big, make me nervous. I think if you compare this, I think 2 of these cups from one thermos, maybe something like that. You understand me? It is nesting constantly going on. And one type of nesting doesn't exclude another one. Let me go to something incredibly interesting. Do you also see that antonyms are nesting each other? We learn first the positive phrase, and then we learn the negation. First we learn into, then we learn out of. They do not happen simultaneous. There is a higher degree of complexity in a negation, which is important to remember when we use negation. To put them on the same plane would rid them of some sort of inborn complexity. And that, when I take away that, that's only me taking away that. It's a subjective take. I lose out on reality if I do that. I am the losing person. Because out there, we are all using these expressions and this thinking to its utmost limit to understand that negation is more complex, needs more. So I can be benefited from this in my world, and I can still communicate this to everyone else. I can use the negation terms even more exact, so I don't lose anything. So Jordan Peterson is like 3 times wrong here. And you can actually be an analytical philosopher. I could be John Searle and have a good use of this understanding. I don't have to abandon anything. When I have to abandon anything is when I want to do that. That's still my choice. I would say it would be likely that John Searle gave up his project, but he doesn't have to. There's no force here. Reality doesn't have this obligation about it that we usually sort of put into it. And this sort of stuckedness is also bodily stuckedness. It's you open up more, you take in more of the fractality, and that means that your thinking will develop more, because this is another nesting as well. By learning how to nest and de-nest, you will be more accurate. But if you don't want to be accurate, you don't have to. You don't have to go into the deepest level. You use terms when they're fitting. You don't meet a man out in a park and he says, oh, there was a cat there before. And you don't have to say the cat is both dead and alive. It is in the perfect level when it's suitable. So this is a deepening of understanding, and it's also a widening, and it doesn't exclude anything. How beautiful is not that? I say thank you very much. I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.
Excellent.